Is The Dove Game by Isobelle Carmody. It was hot in Paris. The minute Daniel stepped from the air-conditioned cool of Charles de Gaulle Airport, the sun dropped a hammer on his forehead. He stopped at the unexpectedness of it, and a woman in a white dress detoured around him, thin arms and long neck a glowing pink. He'd never imagined people sunburned in Paris. He'd seemed wrong here, misplaced, as if he had somehow brought the aridity of the outback with him. The travel agent had told him to board a raw seat bus to Opera stop in the city. He took his place obediently at the end of a queue running back from the closed doors of the bus. The driver was visible, reading his paper with his knees against the wheel. In front of Daniel, an older couple argued in another language. The woman's voice had an angry, stabbing quality. Daniel thought of the comfortable bickering of his own parents, which had always seemed to him like two old warped boards rubbing together whenever the wind blew from a certain direction. The woman pointed savagely at a mound of luggage, and Daniel wondered what there could be in all those cases and bags. He carried only a half-empty canvas bag, and again he would not be here for long. He thought of the travel agent who had arranged the trip. "You want to be in Paris for one day?" Her voice tinged with disbelief. "Impossible." She typed rapidly, and her face grew smooth as if the computer consumed her personality. "The soonest I can get you home is 5 days from the date you have nominated. The flights are all booked because of the World Cup game in Paris. Soccer," she added, seeing his blank expression, "unless you can travel on another day." "I have to be there on July 1, he reiterated too baldly. Then he told her the district he needed to find and asked for the closest accommodation possible. He could have pointed out the street that was his destination because he had looked it up to make sure it existed. She was already pecking at her computer. "Must be an important meeting," she said crisply, having decided he was a businessman despite the dusty jeans and faded flannel shirt. Her eyes flicked up to offer perfunctory curiosity, as if it was part of her job to encourage travelers to talk about their plans so they could be admired for their adventurousness, or maybe so that they could be reassured that they were doing the right thing. "I am doing the right thing," Daniel said, was startled to discover he had spoken aloud. "I'm sure," the woman smiled, a red, wet-looking smile. In the end, he had agreed to spend the extra days in Paris, but the decision had made him uneasy because it had been forced out of him. The travel agent had explained that countries wanted people to stay and spend money, hence various kinds of inducements and controls. Daniel had thought there was something under the little pad of facts and explanations, the bones of some harder truth. He took the back seat of the bus because it looked as if his long legs would fit better there, but found himself pressed between a teacher from a friend's school in Baltimore, and a German geneticist. He was amazed at how easily and quickly they told their business to one another and to him. He did not resist their questions. "What is a jackaroo?" the geneticist asked with genuine interest. "Sort of Australian cowboy," the American explained. The geneticist admitted her regret that there had been no time to visit the outback. Outback, she said. The American teacher had been on a short exchange to an Australian Quaker school in Tasmania, he said, but he had managed a quick trip to Uluru. He said the word as if it were a giant lolly he was sucking. Daniel almost smiled because tourists always said it that way, with slight self-importance. "But the emptiness," the American murmured, shaking his head. "I can't imagine riding through it alone on a horse. All that red nothingness would scare me." "Nothingness could be an interesting state to experience," the geneticist said, reminding Daniel of someone's nice aunt. He had a disoriented flashback to the campfire. Thai tree talking fiercely about white doctors, his darkness limned in flame glow. "I think they should do anything they can do," the old black man had muttered. "Maybe someday they find something they don't go back together after they open it up. What will grow in that black gap, eh?" The teacher was asking why he had come to Paris, and Daniel collected his wits and said that he had a meeting. "Not a business meeting," he added, to short-circuit the questions. "Personal business," the geneticist said kindly, forcing the teacher to fall silent. But suddenly Dan wanted to hear it said aloud. "I'm going to meet a woman in place of a man who died," he said. "She doesn't know." "How sad," the geneticist exclaimed softly. "She will come to meet her friend and learn that he is dead." "Dead," she said. "A mission of mercy," the teacher approved. "You are a good friend." "No," Daniel almost said, but the bus lurched to a halt, on a huge roundabout running with two wide streams of cars in opposite directions. It was as if someone had decided to tie a knot in the highway. Horns were sounding and brakes screamed, and the noise was such that conversation was impossible. His two companions were gone by the time Daniel emerged, and contrarily, he had felt abandoned. Passengers were streaming from their bus and from others into taxis. There were at least 30 lined up along the curb in front of the bus. He supposed the teacher and the geneticist had already been swallowed up and whisked away. It was like watching the wheels and cogs of a machine winding together. He felt momentarily helpless to exert any will against the inexorable efficiency of it. On impulse, Daniel set off walking in long, loping strides, leaving the knot of traffic behind him. He was soon deep in a maze of streets of ancient buildings 1 and 2 stories high, where gargoyles leered with sly awareness at him over balconies, and impossibly muscled men and voluptuous women were wrapped around columns or holding up doorways. He had a sudden, sharply painful longing for the simplicity of the flat red landscape outside the bedroom window in his parents' home. That particular view of what some would call nothing, framed by limp, flowered curtains. He crossed the street because there was a car parked on the footpath blocking his way, and realized he was panting like a dog. It was something to do with the way the heat was pressed between the stone buildings, maybe, compressed so that it was almost solid. In the outback, the heat was light, stretched thin. You could ride through it slowly for hours without working up a sweat. He took out the map he'd been given and unfolded it awkwardly. He didn't use maps back home. Once when they had come up to the city so that his father could plead with the bank to give them more time to catch up the payments, his father had said sadly that cities were as confused as the people who lived in them, and you needed maps for dealing with them as well. The hotel was a doorway with the name written above in fancy writing and a set of carpeted stairs. The bottom floor was a restaurant, and as he climbed the stairs, the smell of strong coffee ambushed Daniel with a memory of his father, so vivid that for a moment he actually seemed to see the older man's hands on the rail instead of his own. Bigger, always bigger, soft-furred with golden hair that caught the sunlight, huge scarred knuckles, and the missing index finger. Daniel stopped, realizing he was slightly dizzy. The feeling reminded him of having sunstroke as a kid. He still remembered how everything had sagged and tilted when he moved, the heaviness of the shadows and the silky feeling of the sickness. An older woman in a fitted green dress and a smooth bun examined him with shrewd eyes as he approached the reception desk. Once he had filled out the papers and had proffered his passport, she pressed the lift button for him and explained that breakfast was to be eaten in the restaurant below. He had only to show his key to the waitress. The room, when he reached it, was tiny. He bumped his elbows on both walls going to the toilet, was forced to shower with the door open, struggling with a single anonymous lever that controlled heat, cold, and the forces of the jet. At length he stretched out naked on the bed, the damp towel laid over his groin. He'd slept for long, disjointed periods on the plane. His eyes felt gritty, the way they did after a long day of riding in the sun, his body jumpy and tense from lack of exercise. He didn't remember when he had done so little. He had felt so tired. He needed to walk, he decided. He slept. He was walking through the fields at dusk, and he saw that there was a pool of light on the horizon, where there ought to be nothing but more night. "What's that, Dad?" he asked, and discovered from the sound of his voice that he was a boy again. "Circus," his father said, squinting his eyes and peering toward the light. "Want to go, boy? Don't suppose it'll be anything special. A mangy lion with its teeth and a few clowns. A lot of rigged sideshow acts to draw your money. We could take a look-see if you want." A slow, kind smile. Dan felt an aching love for his father that burst the seams of the dream. He woke to find the room dark and stiflingly hot, bedclothes wrapped about his limbs as if they were bandages. Disentangling himself, he padded over to open a window. It was as if he had merely opened the window into a larger room. Leaning out into the still, hot night, he looked down into the street below, thought of the dead man's watch, the way its wide silver band incorporating the face had matched the overturned silver car, the silvery gray suit, which might have been sleek before the crash. The man had seemed as exotic as a metal spaceman lying in the red dust. His eyes had been a light silvery gray, too, when they opened. "Help me," the man said. His accent was thick and heavy, but part of the heaviness was pain. There were visible head injuries, and Daniel knew it could be fatal to move him. "There's a property back about 30 clicks. The Watleys. Tim will radio the flying doctor." The man made a strange rattling noise. Was he laughing? I fear there is only one creature with wings that will come for me in time. Daniel began to shake his head. The man's blood was puddling in the red dust under him, darkening it to black. It looked as if his shadow was swelling under him. Daniel knelt, but the man's nearest hand twitched in agitation, the silver watch throwing a knife of light into his eyes with accidental, painful precision. "There is a woman," he rasped, and Daniel half turned in alarm to the crumpled car before he continued. "You must tell her what has happened." "The police," Daniel said. "Shh!" The man hissed like a snake. "Will you help me?" The pale eyes held Daniel's with a strength that seemed hypnotic, and he found himself nodding. "Tell her that I would have come if I could, that she was right about me needing her. I have the ticket in my wallet. You must go to Paris and meet her in my place." How strange the word had sounded, spoken in the hot air, the end of it caught by the harsh, flat arc of a kookaburra's laugh rising in the spare distance. "Paris?" Daniel said, relieved, because of course no one could expect him to go to Paris. "I was to meet her on the 1st of July. "You must have a friend who could call her," Daniel had protested. Again the rattling laugh, this time with a mocking note. The light eyes were now fixed on his face. For a moment Daniel thought there was a radiance behind them, something struggling to blaze out. Perhaps it was no more than a matter of contrast and light, the white-hot light in the tanned skin. Even so, he felt the touch of those eyes like fingers moving on his face. When the man answered, the grain of the voice was stronger, rougher, as if the smooth surface of it was being sanded away. "I do not have a telephone number, nor any address for her, only the date and the name of the cafe where we were to meet." Daniel blinked, feeling as if a genie had appeared to grant 3 wishes, when it was one wish, and he must grant it. "Maybe she won't come." "She will," the man said. He had begun to shudder slightly, like a cat Daniel had once seen after it had been snake-bit. "We were to meet," the man whispered, "in the cafe where I first saw her." Such an absurd name for a cafe. The Smoking Dog, Rue de Gris, July 1st at dusk. She said it would be appropriate. I thought she was mad, but now I know that she saw everything. Tell her that. The cafe has had a view of the Sacré-Cœur. Daniel had looked up the French words in a phonetic dictionary. Rue de Gris merely meant Gray Street. Sacré-Cœur meant Sacred Heart, probably meant Sacred Heart Cathedral. He'd looked the street up on a map of Paris, found that there were 7 different Gray Streets, only one that would have a view of the cathedral. Somewhere in the hotel, a baby began to cry. As Daniel turned away from the window, he heard men's voices in the streets below, the words unintelligible, hard blot of some other language that did not sound French. Arabic, maybe. He took up the television control on the bedside console, pressed the mute button, and channel surfed. Usually he found it soothing to see people talking silently, gesticulating and laughing, cars driving silently along roads, washing machines being caressed. But tonight, for the first time, the images seemed weirdly significant, too filled with meanings he did not want to puzzle out. He lay back and watched the play of light reflected on the roof instead, wondering again if the dead man and the woman he had promised to meet had been lovers. "Let sleeping dogs lie," his mother might have said. She'd been a tough, stocky, practical little farmer's wife with a small, beloved flock of hysterical, silky chickens. She performed a staggering number of daily duties. Daniel had grown up with no idea that his mother was a domestic slave, though. She'd been a woman with a sharp edge to her tongue and strong opinions that she did not hesitate to air. Discipline had been her provenance, too. She'd wielded a willow switch with the same determined efficiency as she cleaned the rugs once a month, as if misbehavior could be beaten out like dust. Age had bent and narrowed his father, faded his blue eyes, but his mother became more and more solid without ever being fat, more densely energetic. Daniel fancied that in another life his father might have been a poet or a writer, but his mother could only ever have been a farmer's wife. Daniel had loved his father and respected him. It always seemed a waste of time to bother wading through a lot of words written by someone he didn't know, when he could be roaming the hills, rippling with dry grass like a golden sea, or swimming in the tea-colored water of the creek. It did not matter to him that he was barely average at school, since he was to inherit and work the farm. Of course, it hadn't worked out that way. His father had overextended to buy some long overdue farm equipment. There was a bad year of droughts, and then a year of floods, and the bank foreclosed. They had gone under without a struggle, and Daniel's mind stuttered to watching his mother creating her beloved silkies for sale. He'd hated the unit in suburbia where they had shifted. He knew that his parents needed his income to help pay the mortgage. He'd gone to work loading in a trucking company. Then 3 months after they had moved into town, his father had a heart attack on the way to church, crashing the ute and killing himself and his wife both. She had been killed on impact, but his father had lingered for 3 days. They had never become conscious. Daniel had been glad it had happened so suddenly. They had died together for their sakes. Even now, years later, memories kept jumping up at him, forcing him to remember that his parents were gone and he would never see them again. Never feel his father's gentleness and watch him tamp down the tobacco in his pipe. Never see his mother's ferocious energy or taste her golden syrup dumplings. He had left the city, for the suburban unit had been sold to pay their debts, so had begun his long drift from job to job, looking for some indefinable thing that would make him feel that same sense of rightness and belonging that he had felt on the old farm. The smell of eggs and bacon on dark winter mornings, bitter aftertaste of strong sweet tea in the bunkhouse kitchens brought the home breakfast back to him with such clarity that the present had sometimes seemed a thin, sour dream. But if he was honest, it was his father he missed most, his quiet presence. His father had always known the best way to gentle people was to be gentle, to listen. You never got the feeling he was just waiting for you to finish so he could get on with what he wanted to say, or offer advice or an opinion. In fact, he said very little and seldom offered solutions or suggestions. Yet at one time or another, practically every one of the neighbors had come to him for advice. People would invariably go away feeling less angry, less desperate. Daniel had consciously modeled himself on his father, wanting that quiet dignity. He had striven to be patient, gentle, courteous, and honest. He was not, and never would be, his father, and he believed that he had grown into a man his father would have respected. How many times he'd imagined telling his father about seeing the smoke and then the overturned silver Mercedes crumpled against the stand of eucalyptus. How many times he described dragging the big foreigner in his supple steel dust suit from the wreck, the strange conversation that had followed. In his imaginings, as in life, his father never once interrupted his tale. Nor, when Daniel stopped, had he offered opinions or advice. Yet in the ambience of his father's wisdom, Daniel had come to understand that he would go, even though it had meant flying farther than he had ever flown before. Was it possible to return after coming so far? He suddenly wondered. The thought was like a kidney punch. He stumbled mentally backwards into a vivid memory of the way the dying man's eyes had grown more and more pale as he drifted in and out of delirium. It was so hard to trust anyone back then, he said. You never knew who would repeat your words, nor how they might be used. You could never be high enough to feel safe. You had to be careful with every word. Yet she trusted me. Of all people, her was incredible, unthinkable. She said I had offered her an ultimate truth. I do not think you could possibly imagine how rare truth was in that time. I swore that I would meet her, but I lied. She laughed and said I would come to her for the truth that she alone could offer. He bit down on a groan. There had been something almost military in the stifling of the groan, Daniel thought. The man had been in terrible pain, the ambulance people had said after they came. Even if they had arrived in time, they could not have helped except to administer a mind-obliterating dose of morphine, they said. A little death to ease the bigger death looming. It was the police, when he gave his report several days later, who had told him the man's name was Tibor Horvath. He was Hungarian and 85. Daniel could hardly credit it. He would have taken the man for 50 at most. He'd held a permanent residency visa for Australia for 60 years, not once left since his arrival. He'd probably been a dissident, given the date of his arrival, one of the policemen women had observed, a political exile from his country, which had been under Russian occupation at the time. Later that same night, it had occurred to Daniel that if the man had made an appointment to meet the woman when they had been in Paris, the dates the police had given meant this agreement had been made more than 60 years ago. He thought of the dying man's final words, eyes fastening on him with congealing clarity. Tell her the knowledge that she was right tortures me. The following week, when he had gone into town to sign his deposition, a policeman told him about the ticket found in the man's coat. The destination was Paris. The departure date was 2 days before the date when the man had claimed he was to meet the woman. That was when it had occurred to Daniel that the woman might be dead. He assumed she was the man's age, but if she'd been older, say 30, she would be almost 90 now. Daniel had contacted the police to find out when and where the funeral would take place, wondering if anyone would attend who might offer clues to the woman's identity, and to whom he might confide the dead man's last wish. But no one came other than a policeman who was there for the same reason. Over a beer after, the policeman told him that the dead man had left money enough for his funeral. The remainder of his property was going to a charity that cared for children. It seemed he had not worked at all, having come to Australia with a collection of antique family jewelry that he had sold, investing the money and living off the proceeds. It seems impossible that a man could have lived so long without making any sort of connections, Daniel had murmured. You would be surprised how many people live that way, the policeman responded. Standing and watching the earth shoveled onto the coffin, Daniel pictured a woman coming into the cafe to sit and wait for a man who would never arrive. In the imagining, she was very frail, a female version of his father, emanating patience and gentleness. She was a woman who you could see would wait until the end of the day, hope slowly fading until she was asked to leave. Another thing that the dying man had muttered floated through his mind. There's no greater intimacy than truth, boy. Remember that. He woke to thick late afternoon sunlight and showered again, thinking of Mick, the stocky Irish owner of the small boxing gym that Daniel had joined when he was 15. His father had not understood that the attraction of boxing was not the violence or the conquering of one man by another. Daniel had liked the gallantry of a sport where two men could drink and slap one another on the back between bouts. The sport was symbolized for him by Mick, with whom he had developed a relationship that had begun with respect and admiration, had become, though the word would never be spoken between them, love. Mick had been disappointed when Daniel decided not to go professional, and it was love of Mick that had kept him sparring young newcomers, trying to teach the aggressive young cocks the need to be smart fighters rather than street sluggers. Few of them had the deep-down gallantry that Daniel considered to be the secret of greatness. After his parents had died, Mick tried to talk him into working for the gym, but Daniel refused and had started drifting. He hadn't seen much of Mick the last couple of years, but he had told the older man of his decision to go to Paris and why, after asking him to stable his quarter horse. It's like I picked up a stone when that man died, Mick. Have to find the place to put it down, he had said. It's a deep thing to watch a man die, Mick had murmured, a stern, distant look in his brown eyes. Daniel had remembered that once, earlier in Mick's career, one of his fighters had developed a blood clot in the ring. Mick still sent Christmas cards to the widow, though 20 years had passed. How will you know who she is? Mick had asked in the car, having insisted on driving Daniel to the airport. She'll be alone, and she'll be looking for someone. She might not be alone, Mick had said, and everyone is looking for someone. Walking through the streets, Daniel was again struck by the heat and by the ornate, battered age of the city. Many of the buildings had obviously been sandblasted or repainted in recent times, though more buildings were crumbling at the edges and gray with filth than refurbished. On every street there was at least one building undergoing a facelift, surrounded by a carapace of scaffolding and billowing plastic. He was startled when the asphalt suddenly gave way to smooth, oyster-gray cobbles like something out of a grim fairy tale. He made no effort to orientate himself using the map. He was beginning to become aware of a flow along the streets, like a hidden current. He turned a corner and collided with a couple kissing. They seemed oblivious to the impact. He didn't see kissing like that back home, other than in the movies, Daniel thought. Not that he knew much about it. He had kissed exactly 3 women in his life. One of them had been a whore who had taken pity on his embarrassed inadequacy. The other boys had not believed his tale, claiming that prostitutes did not kiss. Even now he did not know what to make of the fact that a prostitute had broken what seemed to be some sort of cardinal rule in kissing him, or what he had done to provoke it. He passed through a square, and there were a group of black men talking, dressed in expensive suits. They began laughing, flashing confident white teeth. Daniel wondered what it would be like at home if the aboriginals that drifted into town to drink and socialize in the park and malls would dress in suits like that. There was something so crushed and battered about the old derelicts you saw drinking in the streets. No matter how aggressive or strident they would get about native title, way it had split the Aboriginal community. As Daniel walked, his mind flicking back and forward between life on his parents' farm and his current errand, as if it was trying to weave a tapestry connecting the two. It was only when he entered a street and saw the sun touching the tops of the buildings that he reached for his map. He traced out a path from where he was to Grey Street, near the Sacré-Cœur Cathedral. He walked swiftly, thinking that there was something primitive about arranging a meeting at dusk, something that suggested a state where ordinary time and space did not apply. The roads had grown busier than before, and people walked purposefully, their faces abstracted by end-of-day thoughts. Daniel found that no matter which way he walked, on which side of the pavement he chose, he was moving against the flow of human traffic. He passed a rectangular pool of water where various mechanical devices were variously spitting, stirring, plowing, or slashing the water. "You see that one?" a man said in accented English. "I call it the jealousy machine. See how stupidly it threshes at the water? How ferocious its movement? Yet it goes nowhere." The words provoked a memory of a fight Daniel had seen between two Aboriginal men in a camp far from towns and police. He'd met them on a walkabout during a boundary ride and had been invited to join them. The men had begun by talking, but had ended up almost killing each other over a woman they both wanted. They had fought with a ferocity that Daniel had never witnessed between two white men, not in the boxing ring, nor out of it. There had been no sense of display nor of competition. They had fought almost silently and for nothing, since the woman had chosen another man. The soles of his feet were burning by the time he turned into Rue de Gris. Two men standing on the opposite corner were watching him, both with their hair shaven so short he could see their scalps shining pinkly through the black stubble. One had a swastika tattooed on his upper arm. He nodded, a half-smile, curving narrow, soft-looking lips, and Daniel's neck prickled. He had the sudden, absurd notion that they had been watching for him. It was the sun and lack of food making him imagine things, he told himself. A headache drilled into the top of his skull like a hot needle when he came to the end of the street, realized he must have walked right past the cafe. He retraced his steps, and only then understood that there had been nothing to miss. The street was short, and the only thing in it, aside from residences and apartments, was a small boutique with a hat draped in a swath of red cloth. When he reached the shop, he noticed there was also a small tobacconist on the other side of the road. He was about to turn away when his eyes fell on the sign above the tobacconist, "The Smoking Dog." The name of the shop, "The Smoking Dog." "I thought it was a cafe," Daniel told the owner. "I've come all the way from Australia." The man's eyes slitted, but perhaps it was only that he had got some of the coiling, heavy-looking smoke from his cheroot in his eyes. "Then you've come a long way for nothing." The fact that he was English startled Daniel to silence, which seemed to prompt the man to elaborate. "There used to be a cafe here during the war. It was burned down by the Germans. No one ever bothered to restore it. The place was a mess when I took it over. I bought it because the name seemed like a good omen." "Burnt," Daniel said softly. "It was used by the resistance during the war, apparently. Locals say they were betrayed, and the Boche took them all away, then burned the cafe out to make sure it couldn't be used again." Daniel licked his lips. The policewoman back home had said that the dead man had probably been a political refugee. Was it possible he and the woman had been resistance? How had they escaped the German raid of the cafe? And why plan to meet more than 60 years later? Unless the promised exchange had been no more than a desperate reassurance for two people who expected to die. "I was to meet a woman in the cafe this evening." "You want a woman?" There was a mocking note in the man's voice. "A particular woman. I have something I need to tell her," Daniel said. "Forget about a woman who makes an appointment in a place that doesn't exist. Go back where you belong." "I'm not sure where I belong anymore," Daniel murmured, and though it was a simple enough comment to make, he felt a sudden dizziness at the depth of his words, unexpected abyss of truth. "You can see the cafe if you want. The shop is only a frontage." The man stood up from his stool, becoming in an instant extraordinarily tall. He opened a door behind the counter, and Daniel entered the darkness of an enormous warehouse-sized room whose walls retained striped sections of what once had been a giant mural. There were round tables set in the floor, and a few chairs stacked in the shadows. He had a strange sense that he had stepped back in time, at least into another dimension. "The whole place was done out to look like a circus," the man said, relighting his black cheroot. The flame rocked back and forward in his eyes. "The name is supposed to have come from some famous sideshow act with a dog. As far as I can tell, It's the sort of place where people came and sat and smoked and talked poetry, waved their hands and burst into tears or danced on the tables. An emotional sort of place. Good cover for secret meetings and the passing on of information and microfilms and all the rest of it. You still smell the smoke from the fire. That's why I got it cheap. The tobacconist turned back, and as Daniel followed, he heard quite distinctly a gasp or a cough. He looked around, but there was no movement. The shadows hung like frozen smoke, darkening with every minute that passed. The shop had also darkened in their brief absence, and the owner reached for a panel of switches on the wall as Daniel dug out the receipts in his wallet and scrawled the address of his hotel on a desk blotter and the name of the dead man. The woman would come in, or she wouldn't. Lights flickered on, and the tobacconist touched the indentation of the words written on the soft, thick paper. "I'll call back tomorrow," Daniel promised. He thanked the man and went out into the street. He walked several blocks before he noticed a small boy shadowing him. Clad in scruffy, too big clothes, his skin was the color of dark honey, and his eyes fringed in lashes as long as those of a newborn calf. "You want to go to the circus?" the boy asked, seeming unabashed. "Circus," he said. "Circus?" he echoed, wondering if he had misheard. The boy giggled. "I will show you the way." "What kind of circus happens in the middle of a city?" Daniel asked. "A very small circus," the boy said, and they laughed together. Daniel felt suddenly lighter. "All right, then," he said. The boy's pixie face lit up, and he led the way to a lane of steep stone steps descending into a small square. There, to Daniel's amazement, was a circus tent. Lanterns were swaying around the rim, illuminating sections of the billowing cloth which blurred away into the growing night. The boy ran lightly down the steps ahead of Daniel and vanished. Daniel might have turned back, but he heard music, long, sobbing notes which seemed to be the essence of yearning, which roused in him an unexpected longing to be home, ride the red flat plains on Snowy, or up in the high country. Had the sudden unsettling thought that home, like his parents, was irrevocably lost to him. "Shall I tell you your heart's desire?" The voice belonged to a gypsy woman with a small baby in her arms. She was squatting in the doorway of a small tent which appeared to be an extension of the larger tent. His silence seemed to irritate her. "But you have no time for that, have you? You have come to see her, of course. Another moon calf lusting for the dove princess. She has nothing to offer you." The gypsy gave an angry shrug and suddenly bared a plump golden breast. The baby butted and struggled against its bindings, then began to suckle hard as Daniel moved away. He circled the tent until he came to a wide flap door, pulled shut, but hanging crookedly, so as to leave a slit through which light leaked out into the darkness. Daniel pushed through the flap into a curtained corridor. The tent folds were heavier than they looked, and when the wind made them sway, a heavy, musty smell puffed out of them. The music grew steadily louder as he passed through another flap into the main section of the tent. It was considerably smaller than it had looked from the outside, only 3 concentric circles of bench seats behind the battered red bolsters that rimmed the spot-lit central ring. Daniel paid 100 francs to a lean gypsy, then took an end seat, eye snared by a high-wire artist in glittering red and gold, spiraling down on a rope. She bowed and ran out through a slit in the tent as the audience applauded thinly. A man entered through another slit, clad in black, his hair slicked into a stiff black quill. A magician, his clothes and flamboyant gestures proclaimed. He bowed gracefully, then beckoned, and a boy appeared, wheeling a glittering gold casket as big as a fridge on wheels. Cymbals clashed, and another boy entered, leading a small white goat. There was a burst of the tragic violin music, and the gypsy magician began to speak. His words were French. It was clear from his movements that he was describing himself as an animal tamer of the most ferocious sort of beasts. Then very slowly and theatrically he opened the mouth of the goat, pushed the top of his head gently against its teeth. It ought to have been funny, that music and the seriousness of the dark-clad man, allied to the eccentric performance. A plump woman nearest Daniel, chewing her nails, gave a bark of muffled laughter. An elderly couple that looked like tourists laughed too, but uncertainly, as if they were anxious to do the right thing. A young man with a shaven head and ripped t-shirt laughed loudest, slapping his knees and rocking back and forward. And for some strange reason, the performance brought tears to Daniel's eyes. It seemed to him in that second that he'd been led to this place in this country in the same way as the goat had been led to the stage, to take part in some incomprehensible performance which he understood no more than the goat understood its part in this strange little circus. The violin music swelled. Daniel's father had loved classical music. He said that most of it was like beauty prowling in a cage. It was like the strange wildness of this gypsy music. The spotlight split and the music stopped abruptly. All that could be heard was the wind and the flapping of the tent walls and roof. Then a pale, strikingly lovely, dark-haired woman stepped through the tent wall and into a circle of light. Daniel's breath seemed to solidify and wedge in his throat. She wore nothing but a flesh-colored frame of a crinoline fastened to her waist, through which her legs and bare feet could clearly be seen. Her nipples were pale pink and very small. A movement drew Daniel's gaze to the magician, who now held a knife with a broad, gleaming blade. Daniel saw the glitter of his eyes as he kissed the blade. Despite knowing it was part of the performance, he felt a hard jab of fear for the woman, whose hand rose slowly on the slender stalk of her arm. The gypsy violinist began to play a long, rising note. Suddenly, the magician hurled the knife across the arena with enough force to make him grunt. Daniel's eyes followed the shining dart, but almost exactly halfway between the magician and the woman, it exploded silently into feathers and light, and a bird completed the journey, fluttering to the woman's raised hand. A white dove. A trick, Daniel murmured as he watched the woman bring the bird to her face and kiss its beak. Then she carried it down to the crinoline, and it stepped neatly into one of the squares in the wide grid that caged her slim white legs. She gestured to the man. A movement of the hands that was both an invitation and an offering, and he bowed and threw another knife. This time Daniel heard the whistle of the blade, or imagined he did, and the chill crept along his bones, though again sharp steel was transformed into feathers and beak, to land and be carried to sit beside the first dove. It was no kiss this time. The music had quickened. Another knife, and then another was thrown. Daniel could not imagine how the trick worked, but there seemed to him something deadly in this game of dove being played. The forehead of the magician gleamed with sweat, though in the tent it was cold enough that his breath formed a cloud when he exhaled. As each bird swelled the dress, clothing her lower body, the woman became more and more ravishing and unreal-looking. It was as if she was becoming a dream or a legend before his eyes. When the dress was a swaying bell of doves, how heavy it must be, though her face was serene and her expression distant. The birds began to land on her shoulders and upper body, leaving only the thin arms and the long throat. Daniel noticed a streak of blood on her neck and another on her arm, realized that the doves landing on her shoulders and chest were tearing at her in their effort to gain purchase. One of the bird's claws must have cut her deeply, for a seam of blood crawled down her arm and into her palm. Yet the woman's face was remote. Her eyelids drooped slightly over her eyes as if she were half in a swoon. Daniel felt sickened to see beauty coupled with pain in this way. The flight of doves had not faltered, and the defenselessness of the woman, her pallor and the way she offered it to the doves, seemed an invitation to pain. It was as if her beauty existed to serve only as an assistant to pain. The magician, his costume blotched darkly with patches of sweat now, threw another knife. Daniel realized suddenly that the blood was part of the act, and felt a fool. Of course, that must be it. What did it mean? He wondered suddenly. The clothing of a woman in doves, the thin line of blood. Was he to see that even though knives became doves, the woman was still pierced? Was that it? Or was the meaning too foreign or complex for him to grasp? Something that he was simply unequipped to understand. He found himself visualizing the two aboriginal men engaged in their silent, deadly fight. He had been transfixed by their beauty and the alienness of their culture, watching them. This performance seemed to him to contain the same violence, the same serenity, the same alien quality. He was repelled by the extremity of what he was seeing, but he could not leave. As more birds flew to join the others, it became harder to see where each bird ended and another began. The dress trembled and throbbed with a life that seemed separate from all the lives that it strove to encompass. Daniel wondered what his father would say. It was as if a thought from someone else's mind had drifted into his own. For the first time, his father's face seemed ghostly and insubstantial. When there was no more room on her arms, the doves began to light directly on her hair, consuming the darkness as they had consumed her arms. Another drop of blood slid along the side of her nose, curving into the corner of her eye and then touching the edge of her lips. Her tongue flicked out to touch the blood. Daniel shuddered as if she had pushed her tongue onto his ear. And still more birds landed. It was going on too long, Daniel thought, realizing with a kind of dim horror that he was bored. Surely only a monster could be bored with something so finely balanced between beauty and freakishness as to dissolve the difference. Outside the tent, the wind was now howling. The cloth billowed and heaved in convulsive shudders. Outside the tent, the wind was now howling. The cloth billowed and heaved in convulsive shudders. Then the music changed, falling steeply to a low humming note. For 1 second she stood there, perfectly still, a woman in a living dress, the dove princess. Then another knife was thrown, which became 3 doves that rose and circled above the woman before suddenly closing their wings, hawk-like, plummeting toward the woman's upturned face. At the last moment they banked their wings and landed on her face. Daniel gasped and started forward in his seat, seeing the claws nearing the wide-open eyes, but he did nothing to arrest the performance. He could not, for he must see what would come next. He was sickened by his own reactions, and yet as he breathed too deeply and too fast, feeling as if each breath he took was clogged with old dust and feathers, he did not take his eyes from the woman-shaped mass of birds seething in the spotlight. Everything was in motion in these seconds. The tent, the air, the doves, his blood. The only fixed point was the black-clad magician, the eye in the storm. He clapped his hands once, and the doves rose up in a churning mass, swirling and widening at the top until they formed a shifting funnel, a white whirlwind. Then they exploded outward, and in their midst was nothing. The woman had vanished as the knives had done. For one brief moment, there were only the falling of feathers, a pale benediction from the departing birds, and then the spotlight winked out, plunging the tent into near darkness. The performance had ended, and there were only lanterns showing the way to the entrance. But no warning or space for applause. The people began to rise without the slightest protest or murmur of puzzlement. Daniel saw now that the men wore business suits as if they had come from work, while some of the women wore casual dresses of the kind they might wear about the home with coats over them. None of them looked as if they had dressed intending to come see such a show. It was as if all of them had been summoned from everyday life to experience the dove game. Their faces were pale, as if something had been drained from them. But Daniel felt that the churning forces of the performance that entered him were beating their wings against his chest, clawing at his throat. The boy that had led him to the tent stepped toward him from a shadow as if on cue. "You saw her?" he asked with suppressed excitement. "Why does she—" Daniel began, rising from his seat. "This is what they always ask," the boy interrupted gleefully. "Maybe she will answer you. Come." Daniel followed the boy again, discovering in movement that he ached the way he had after having ridden for days in the high country in winter, looking for lost stock. He stumbled twice, not because of the darkness, but because the pale woman in her dove dress had imprinted her image against his retina, so that whenever he blinked, that was what he saw. The boy led the way into the tented corridor, but instead of passing along it as the other spectators did, put his hand through a slit hidden in the folds in the walls of the corridor, his smile inviting Daniel into another corridor running parallel to the main tent. There was another flap ahead with reddish light showing at the edges. The boy made an urgent pushing motion, and Daniel found himself entering a small, circular room carpeted in overlapping, mismatched mats. This tent was maroon and hung in thick, deep folds as if it were a larger tent erected in a too small space. There were piles of cushions around a low table. A half-drunk bottle of red wine glowed in the light of a lantern suspended from the cord of an old dressing gown. A plastic burger container beside the lantern was half filled with cigarette butts, and the air smelled of ash and some sort of chemical. There was a kerosene heater to one side of the flap, the source of the reddish light and the chemical-scented warmth. Suddenly a man stepped forward from the folds of the wall. It was the magician, whose black hair now hung loose and lank over his shoulders. Belatedly, it occurred to him that he had walked into some sort of trap. But the man said, in guttural English, "You want to see the woman? Sit, and we will discuss it." Daniel was startled to see how theatrical and foxy his features were in the reddish light, almost as if he had made himself up to look that way. His eyes, flecked with reddish brown, were expectant. "No," Daniel stopped, confused. "Is it the violence that attracts those who come here?" "Violence? You mean the claws?" He looked momentarily irritated. "Wine?" He sat, and Daniel nodded and sat too, awkwardly cross-legged. The man poured wine into 2 plastic cups which he had brought from beneath the table in a practiced gesture. "People always want to speak to her afterward. They think that if they understand why she allows herself to be used, they will understand the essence of desire. Where is she? The question burst from Daniel. She vanished, the fox-faced magician said. He offered a sly smile. Didn't you see? It was a trick. You don't think people can be obliterated by desire? The magician asked. Suddenly his hand darted out and he caught Daniel's, turning it palm up with a quick, strong twist. Here is a working hand, and yet the hand of a child who knows nothing. He frowned and his mouth softened. Nothing more than a child's pain, perhaps, which is far from nothing. Daniel pulled his hand free, wondering with sudden cynicism if he had been even more of a fool. The blood wasn't real, was it? The magician's smile broadened. Nothing is more real than blood. Where have you come from, my prince? Daniel felt his head jerk slightly. I'm Australian. Ah, so, a country of children, I think, full of light and thoughtlessness. His eyes now seemed to glitter. Tell me why you have come here. He placed a suggestive emphasis on the word you that confused Daniel. I came to see a woman, but our Princess of Doves will not meet you, no matter what the boy told you. No, Daniel stammered. The magician seemed not to have heard him. No one ever guesses that she herself designed the game we play, he said. They all want to save her. I'm no more than her tool. We do her bidding, the doves, the boy, and even you. She trained the doves to tear at her. But it's monstrous. Wine slopped over the brim of his untouched cup. Yes, the magician said. That is what gives the game its power. She said it would be so. Those who come sense the truth of the game. One sculpts one's own desire, one's own anguish, perhaps even one's own obliterations, though their wits insist otherwise. But why does she do it? The game of doves reminds her of a truth she experienced in the concentration camps. She says that the truth of pain allowed her to survive. Perhaps that, he gestured vaguely, is her way of surviving. Daniel found his mouth was dry. She was in the camps, but that was decades ago. She couldn't have been more than 5. She's older than she looks, but she was a child then. Children were taken, and not just Jews, gypsies also. The chosen people prefer to forget that, of course. She bears the mark of the survivors, that tattoo of numbers on her wrist. She was actually taken from near here. We come here each year at this time for that reason. She always sends the boy out for men. Like you. His eyes were suddenly darker, redder. Her mind is gone, of course. There are brilliant shards left, but not much else. She says that one day a man will come, and she will show him the truth that he revealed to her. Daniel fought a feeling of panic. He thought of the foreign man dying on a remote outback road, the pale woman in the dove dress who orchestrated her own pain, and wondered if it were possible that she was the woman he'd been sent to meet. He seemed to hear the beating of wings and to feel the full living weight of the doves descend on him as the consuming shape of his own desire to understand. The boy who brought me here, he gasped. A pretty little monkey whom our dove princess feeds and pets and sends running to do her errands. When we are here, I think her madness worsens. That is why she sends him for men. But she never meets with them. They watch the show, and they come here. When they leave, there is money. I will give you money, but I have to see her, Daniel said. I told you, the magician said. You don't understand. I think I know the man she is looking for. There was an accident, and he asked me to come, to meet her and explain. I suppose it was inevitable that eventually she would summon up a man whose madness matched her own, the magician said in a resigned voice. He rose in a fluid movement. Go home, fool. The dove princess will not save you, and you cannot rescue her. Please, Daniel began, no longer sure of his motives. He wanted to see the woman to make sure that she was safe, that she existed, so as to pass on a message that may or may not have been meant for her. Most of all, he wanted to look into her eyes. No, the magician said urgently. He was staring past Daniel, who felt a movement of air behind him. He tried to turn, but a cool hand descended on the back of his neck. Leave us. A woman spoke, her voice a low, liquid flow. When the magician was gone, she said, "I've lived only to return the truth that was given to me." And Daniel felt a knife at his neck, like the tip of a bird's claw. Many things fluttered through his mind then. The sound of madness in the woman's voice, like the beating of a bird trapped in a chimney. The way his father's breath had rattled as he died in the hospital. The sound of the kookaburra's laugh in the dawn as the foreign man died. The way the desert air shimmered and transported images. The damp velvet touch of Snowy's muzzle against his palm. And then at last, the sight of a woman wearing a dress of doves. A tear of blood on her face. Who lived for a truth that was only pain. And he grew old with understanding that some suffering could be so great as to lift a person above life and ordinary experience into a kind of dark immortality. Such pity and longing filled him that Daniel felt his heart crushed under the weight of it. He felt that he was dying of compassion. He turned toward the knife, not caring how it slid shallowly into his skin. She was older than she had looked on stage, but also more beautiful. Her eyes were dark and full of shadows and madness, and her mouth hung slack, though she still held the knife at his throat. He could feel the dribble of blood on his collarbone, the sting of the air, and thought that she must have felt the same thing when the doves clawed at her. "He wasn't resistance, was he?" he whispered, noting how her hair, dark as a raven's wings, stirred at the touch of his breath. He was one of them, a Nazi. How white her face had became, like a skull. "I promised that he and I would face the final truth together when he came," she rasped. "I waited for him. He had no right to your mercy. I will face truth with you," Daniel said, and felt his body grow rigid with desire. "You have not seen the truth of me that he saw," she spat. "Yes," Daniel said, feeling that he was aging years, centuries with each breath. "In there tonight, you made me see it. There is nothing else." "You are young," the woman breathed, but there was a kindling in her eyes, a flare of longing, of ultimate desire. "Can you understand that desire is pain?" "Play the dove game with me," Daniel said. It seemed to him that all his life had been leading him to this moment of exquisite pain, agonized desire. "But you are not the one," the woman said. With the movement of a striking bird, she drew the knife across her throat. Then she laughed as the red mouth widened and her head fell back. Daniel heard a high-pitched scream and knew it was his. When Daniel woke, he was in jail, having been found lying unconscious on the pavement. 2 police came and heard his story. They told him he had been the victim of a scam. He had given the gypsies all the information they needed to dupe him. They did not say he had been a fool, but it was in their faces. That his wallet had been taken was proof. There was no dead woman, they assured him, when he insisted. No body. No permit had been issued for a small gypsy circus anywhere in the city. The day of his departure, Daniel went back to the square where the tent had been. There was no sign of it, of course, only a drift of white feathers in a gutter that might have belonged to the hundreds of roosting pigeons in the building eaves around the square. It was hot again. He sat down on the edge of a fountain and dipped one hand into the water. His temples pulsed with the heat. 2 boys on rollerblades sped by. A woman passed, dragging a screaming, red-faced child, and then an ambulance charged past, and then another. Or maybe they were fire trucks. Daniel tried to picture his mother and father and found their faces with difficulty. It seemed to him that they were drawing rapidly away from him, as if he and his parents had boarded 2 trains going in opposite directions. He felt as if he had begun his journey on the same train, but had somehow left and entered another whose destination was unknown. He thought about the man who had died, wondered if he had been a Nazi soldier who had interrogated and tortured a child to the point where a sort of madness had fused their lives, or if someone in this city, a woman, was mourning the failure of her lover or friend to meet her after a long parting. He dreamed of the woman in the antiseptic night, dreamed that she had embraced him in her dove dress, so that he could not feel where her flesh began and the frantic dove's trembling began. When he entered her, he had felt her touch as a cool hand, as claws, as a knife. Had she cut her throat? Had he dreamed it? Had it been a trick? He shivered despite the heat, or perhaps because of it, and told himself that it was time to go to the airport to catch his plane home. But he thought of the woman in her dove dress, as if that image was a monstrous, pale egg that had been planted inside him. Now he must wait for it to hatch.